your tooth starts to hurt. Not just a dull ache, but the kind of pain that makes it impossible to sleep, impossible to eat, impossible to think about anything else. Now remove painkillers, dentists, fillings, anesthesia, and even a toothbrush from the world. You wake up thousands of years ago. Every new pulse of pain in your jaw means only one thing: days, or sometimes even weeks, of suffering may lie ahead. No one knows whether the pain will go away on its own or only get worse. One tiny tooth can turn a strong hunter into a helpless person who can no longer eat meat, chew roots, or even speak properly. But the most surprising part of this story is that ancient people were not completely helpless. Some of their methods actually worked, others seem like pure madness today, and some were so far ahead of their time that scientists could hardly believe what they were seeing. Archaeologists have discovered evidence that people were treating teeth thousands of years before the first civilizations appeared. What's more, some of these techniques were so sophisticated that modern researchers consider them the first dental procedures in human history. So what really happened when a Stone Age person's tooth started to hurt? Why did many ancient people rarely suffer from cavities, yet still experience other serious dental problems? Could a single bad tooth really lead to death? And why would anyone willingly drill into a tooth without any anesthesia? The answers are far more surprising than you might expect. First, let's destroy one popular myth. Most people assume that ancient humans must have constantly suffered from terrible teeth. After all, they didn't use toothpaste, they didn't brush twice a day, and they certainly never visited a dentist. It seems logical to think their mouths must have been full of cavities, but reality turned out to be almost the exact opposite. Archaeologists have examined thousands of ancient skulls belonging to hunter-gatherers. Surprisingly, they found that cavities were far less common than they are in modern humans. Sometimes only 1 or 2% of all teeth showed any signs of decay. By comparison, today, in some countries, more than 90% of people develop cavities at least once during their lifetime. Why was that? The answer has nothing to do with toothbrushes. The biggest enemy of your teeth isn't poor hygiene, it's sugar. Today, sugar is everywhere. It's not just in candy and chocolate. It's added to bread, sauces, soft drinks, breakfast cereals, yogurt, and dozens of other products. The bacteria living inside our mouths have an endless supply of food. They consume sugar and release acids that slowly dissolve tooth enamel. But tens of thousands of years ago, nothing like that existed. Yes, ancient people occasionally found honey. Sometimes they ate sweet berries or very ripe fruit, but those foods were rare treats. Their diet mainly consisted of meat, fish, nuts, roots, wild plants, and seeds. The bacteria in their mouths simply didn't have enough sugar to aggressively attack their teeth. The result is astonishing. People lived without toothpaste, yet on average, they suffered from cavities far less often than we do today. But that certainly didn't mean their teeth were perfect. Quite the opposite. Almost every meal slowly wore down their enamel. Modern food is soft. We eat bread, pasta, porridge, cooked meat. Our teeth rarely experience extreme stress. For ancient humans, everything was different. Every bite contained tiny grains of sand, particles of dirt, and small stones. Later, when people began grinding grain with stone millstones, things became even worse. Even finely sifted flour contained countless microscopic fragments of stone. Every piece of bread acted like sandpaper. Year after year, their teeth slowly wore away. Archaeologists frequently discover the skulls of 40-year-old individuals whose chewing surfaces have disappeared completely. Instead of the familiar ridges and cusps, only perfectly flat surfaces remain. Sometimes it almost looks as if someone deliberately filed the teeth down. In reality, life itself wore them away. At first, this wear caused very little discomfort, but once the enamel disappeared completely, the next layer, the dentin, became exposed. Dentin is much softer and far more sensitive. That's when severe pain began. Sometimes the wear became so deep that it exposed the pulp chamber where the nerve was located. You can only imagine how painful every bite of food became. But that wasn't the only danger. Sometimes a tooth cracked. Sometimes it broke almost completely. Sometimes hard pieces of food became trapped between the teeth, causing inflamed gums. Even a tiny chip could slowly develop into a serious problem. Interestingly, ancient people quickly noticed the connection between damaged teeth and pain. Of course, they knew nothing about bacteria or microbes. It would take tens of thousands of years before microorganisms were discovered. But they were excellent observers. When a tooth darkened, pain usually followed. When a tooth became loose, eating became difficult. When a tooth cracked after a hard blow, inflammation almost always developed. Generation after generation, experience pointed toward an obvious conclusion. The problem was inside the tooth itself. So the simplest way to stop the pain was to remove its source. Today, having a tooth extracted seems like an ordinary procedure. A few minutes, local anesthesia, sterile instruments, and it's over. For an ancient human, it was a brutal ordeal. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, no guarantee of surviving the procedure. At first, they tried to loosen the tooth with their fingers. If it was already loose enough, they could pull it out without any tools. But if the root held firmly, they used whatever they had available: wooden wedges, animal bones, and later primitive metal tools resembling forceps. The procedure itself was unimaginably painful, yet sometimes that pain became the price of survival. If an infection developed inside the tooth, it could spread farther. Today, a dentist would prescribe antibiotics, drain the infection, or perform a root canal. None of those options existed back then. The infection could spread into the jawbone, then into the bloodstream. After that, the chances of survival dropped dramatically. That's why archaeologists sometimes find ancient skulls with completely healed tooth sockets. This tiny detail is incredibly important. It means the person survived the extraction and lived for many years afterward. Even such primitive procedures sometimes truly saved lives, but there were situations where removing the tooth wasn't possible. For example, when the tooth looked perfectly healthy from the outside, while the pain came from deep inside. And that is where the most surprising part of this story begins. One of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the last few decades happened almost by accident. Researchers were studying the ancient settlement of Mehrgarh, located in present-day Pakistan. The burials there were about 9,000 years old. It seemed impossible that ordinary human remains could still surprise scientists. But then a few teeth caught their attention. They contained perfectly round holes. At first, researchers assumed these were accidental damages that had occurred long after the person's death. But under a microscope, it became clear that the holes had been made intentionally. Even more astonishing, the walls of the holes preserved unmistakable marks left by a rotating tool. The conclusion was unbelievable. Someone had actually drilled people's teeth 9,000 years ago. And these weren't isolated cases. Archaeologists discovered several teeth from different individuals with the same kind of holes. Every opening was located exactly where cavities most commonly develop. The coincidence was far too precise to be accidental. But how could anyone drill a tooth without electricity?
If you watched this far, please give it a like.
The answer turned out to be just as surprising. By that time, people already knew how to drill tiny holes into stone, shells, and bone using a bow drill. Imagine a small wooden bow. Its string was wrapped several times around a thin shaft, tipped with a sharp flint point. As the bow moved back and forth, the drill spun rapidly. That was most likely the very tool used on human teeth. The procedure required incredible precision. One wrong movement would only make the pain worse. There was no anesthesia. The patient had to sit perfectly still while someone slowly drilled away the damaged part of the tooth. Today, such a procedure sounds like torture. But compared to the relentless agony of living with an infected tooth every single day, the choice no longer seems so obvious. Some scientists believe that after drilling, the cavity may have been filled with beeswax, tree resin, or other natural materials. There is still not enough direct evidence to prove this, but the idea makes perfect sense. The exposed hole had to be sealed somehow to keep food from getting inside. In other words, thousands of years before modern fillings were invented, people were already trying to repair their own teeth. This discovery completely changed historians' understanding of dentistry. For a long time, it was believed that dental treatment was a relatively recent invention. Now it became clear that the desire to save a tooth appeared almost as soon as the first permanent settlements did. Of course, not everyone had access to such advanced treatment. Most people relied on what nature provided. They searched for plants that could ease the pain. Interestingly, many of those plants actually contain compounds that are still used in modern medicine today. For example, the bark of certain trees was chewed to reduce inflammation. Other plants had mild pain-relieving properties. Resin from conifer trees contained natural antiseptics. It couldn't cure tooth decay, but it could slow the spread of infection and temporarily ease discomfort. Honey was especially valuable. Today, we know that excessive sugar is harmful to teeth. But natural honey also has powerful antibacterial properties. That's why small amounts of honey were sometimes used to treat wounds and infections, including those inside the mouth. Another surprising helper was saliva. When people chewed tree resin or tough twigs for long periods, they produced more saliva. It washed away food particles and helped neutralize harmful acids. Even something as simple as chewing could provide real benefits. That's exactly why archaeologists regularly discover pieces of ancient birch resin with human tooth marks on them. In effect, they were among the world's first chewing gums. They contained no sugar. On the contrary, birch resin has antibacterial properties. It also helped clean the teeth and gums by removing trapped food. Many cultures also used special chewing sticks. The end of a small twig was chewed until it turned into a soft brush. Then it was used to scrub the teeth. Some trees naturally release antibacterial compounds, making these sticks both a toothbrush and a disinfectant. Remarkably, similar chewing sticks are still used in parts of the world today. But not every treatment was so sensible. One of the most widespread ancient beliefs explained toothaches in a completely different way. People believed that a tiny worm lived inside an aching tooth. Today, that sounds ridiculous. But if you look closely at a tooth destroyed by decay, it's easy to understand where the idea came from. The dark winding cavities really do resemble tiny tunnels carved by some small creature, so people became convinced that if they could drive the worm out, the pain would disappear. To do that, they tried all sorts of methods. Smoke from certain plants was directed toward the aching tooth. The mouth was rinsed with hot herbal infusions. Heated stones were placed against the jaw. Sometimes, strong-smelling oils were used in the hope that the terrible odor would force the mysterious worm to abandon the tooth. Of course, no such worm ever existed, yet some of these treatments did temporarily reduce pain. Warm herbal liquids relaxed the surrounding tissues, while aromatic plants often had mild anti-inflammatory properties. Unfortunately, many treatments made things even worse. Heating an already infected tooth could cause severe burns and increase the inflammation. And if a pocket of pus had already formed, the consequences could be devastating. The most dangerous complication was a dental abscess. The cheek would begin to swell dramatically. The shape of the face would change. Opening the mouth became difficult. Every swallow caused sharp pain. A fever followed. If the abscess drained on its own, the person sometimes recovered. But if the infection spread deeper, it could reach the surrounding tissues, the jawbone, or even the bloodstream. Today, these infections are usually treated successfully. In ancient times, they were often fatal. That means a single diseased tooth really could kill an otherwise healthy person. Archaeologists have discovered skulls with massive destruction of the jawbone surrounding infected teeth. These scars reveal years of severe inflammation that the body simply couldn't overcome. But researchers have also found something equally astonishing. Some people had teeth that were almost completely destroyed, yet they continued living for many years. How was that possible? The answer lies inside the tooth itself. If inflammation lasts long enough, the nerve eventually dies. When that happens, the pain suddenly disappears. To the sufferer, it feels as though the disease has healed on its own. In reality, the tooth is dead. The infection may continue spreading, but it no longer produces the same intense pain. Many ancient people probably considered this sudden relief a miracle. But the greatest turning point in the history of human teeth wasn't the appearance of a new disease, it was agriculture. As long as humans lived as hunter-gatherers, cavities remained relatively uncommon. Everything changed about 10,000 years ago. People began growing wheat, barley, and other cereal crops. Their diet suddenly contained much more starch. Inside the mouth, starch quickly breaks down into simple sugars. Bacteria were given the perfect environment to thrive. From that moment on, archaeologists began noticing a dramatic increase in tooth decay. Interestingly, teeth also became slightly less worn. Soft bread no longer acted like sandpaper, but that advantage was quickly overshadowed by a new enemy, cavities. Thousands of years later, the situation became even worse. People learned how to produce sugar. At first, it was incredibly expensive and considered a luxury. Gradually, it became more affordable. Then, after the Industrial Revolution, sugar spread across the entire world. From that point forward, humanity entered an age in which toothaches became an almost unavoidable part of life for millions of people. The result is a remarkable paradox. Modern humans have access to the greatest dentists in history, yet we also consume the very foods that do the most damage to our teeth every single day. Our distant ancestors had no toothpaste, no fillings, and no anesthesia. Yet in many ways, their diet protected their teeth better than ours does today. The story of tooth pain is really the story of humanity's determination to survive. People pulled teeth with stone tools, chewed medicinal plants, cleaned their mouths with twigs, experimented with drilling teeth thousands of years before civilization, and searched endlessly for ways to ease unbearable pain. Many of their methods were wrong, some were dangerous, but the most remarkable thing is that they never stopped searching for answers. Those thousands of years of trial and error eventually became the foundation of modern dentistry. So the next time you sit comfortably in a dentist's chair and hear the familiar sound of a dental drill, remember the people who underwent almost the same procedure 9,000 years ago, without anesthesia, without electricity, and without any certainty that they would survive the day.
Now's the time to subscribe to the channel.